only time will tell. Like, I can only sit here and speculate.
One other positive movement that seems to be happening under the Biden administration is the removal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this. Obviously, this isn't going to be a comprehensive end of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. Obviously, the CIA is going to stay and probably going to be involved in various other ways. But can we see it as a net positive that after 20 years, U.S. forces are being pulled out of Afghanistan?
So I might have a bit of an unpopular opinion on this, like coming from a left perspective, but I actually think it should be the left perspective, and here's why. I think the U.S. absolutely needs to leave Afghanistan. That said, the way they've gone about leaving is completely atrocious and has thrown the country under the bus. I mean, the U.S. is the reason Afghanistan is destroyed, and I'm not talking about just invading in 2001. I'm talking about back in the 1980s when the U.S. armed and funded the Mujahideen, which was this collective of jihadist Islamist groups that wanted to impose right-wing, religious, theocratic tyranny on the country, and they were doing that to undermine the Soviet Union, which was backing a communist government in Afghanistan, which of course had its issues, but it wasn't demanding that women not go to school. In fact, it was the opposite. They wanted to increase the literacy rate and provide healthcare in rural areas and education in rural areas. And the U.S. was funding and arming people who threw acid in women's faces, people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was one of the biggest recipients of CIA funding. And also, the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan supported people like Osama bin Laden, who was a part of the Afghan Arabs who went there to fight for the Mujahideen. And then eventually the Soviet Union collapsed and pulled out of, before they collapsed, they pulled out of Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen took over, and it was completely crazy and lawless in a country destroyed and ruled by warlords until these people called the Taliban, who were being educated in these schools, in these madrasas, in these refugee camps of Afghans in Peshawar in Pakistan. That's where the Taliban came from. They were the children, the young boys who were in those refugee camps in Peshawar, or Peshawar. I always say it wrong. But the point is the U.S. war in Afghanistan created that refugee situation, and then created the situation where then these Saudi-backed school textbooks and these Saudi-backed schools and these refugee camps raised a generation to support Salafi Wahhabism. And then they went back and then they invaded Afghanistan in the 90s and pushed out the Mujahideen warlords that had been running the country and took over. And that's how the Taliban came to power in Afghanistan, as a result of U.S. meddling. And that's why women couldn't go to school for a decade and are still not able to go to school in some areas in Afghanistan. But then, of course, 9/11 happens, and then 9/11 happens because of Al-Qaeda, which comes out of the U.S. funding for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. So that was blowback for America funding right-wing crazy people. And then the U.S. went back into Afghanistan, took out the Taliban, and put the warlords back in power. And for the last 20 years, that's the government we've been propping up, is this corrupt government of warlords. That said, the way the U.S. went about leaving is to literally just hand the country back over to the Taliban. That's what the U.S. has done. And I think that that's really problematic. I don't think the Taliban should be in charge of Afghanistan. I don't think the U.S. should stay forever, though, so I don't really know what the right answer is or if there's anything the U.S. could have done. That said, where I want to take this to, though, is I want to pivot to Iraq. Because this campaign to end the forever war, to end the endless wars, while it's definitely a good goal, I don't understand why it wasn't focused on Iraq. Why the focus on Afghanistan instead of Iraq? Afghanistan, yes, we should get out. But Afghanistan is also a place where you can't just leave, because when you just leave, the government that's dependent on you to exist collapses, and the alternative is the Taliban. And that's what we're seeing happen now, whereas Iraq has a functioning state, has a functioning government, is a functioning, relatively secure country, and if the U.S. left, nothing would change. Nobody would even notice if the U.S. left, because it's a stable country with a functioning government that can work. It's not dependent on the U.S. to function. So I just don't understand why all of the effort went into urgency and, we have to leave Afghanistan immediately and now as soon as possible. instead of using that political capital on Iraq. I can only imagine it's because Afghanistan no longer has any relevance to U.S. empire. The U.S. doesn't really need to be in Afghanistan in terms of maintaining its hegemony, whereas it does need to be in Iraq to maintain its hegemony and to maintain imperialism and to maintain empire and to choke Iran and to continue to control the oil and to continue to stand in the way of a united Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, a united region. And so anyways, those are my thoughts on that, is I really think that the sentiment for ending these wars is, of course, important, and I support it, and I do support the U.S. getting out of Afghanistan, and eventually it had to happen. I guess it's kind of like pulling off the Band-Aid, but I think the way that the U.S. went about it is very wrong, and that we should have been focused more on, if we're going to get out of somewhere, let's get out of Iraq, let's get out of the Middle East, you know what I mean?
Well, in regards to Afghanistan, though, in leaving, what do you think would be a more responsible way, or what do you think that the U.S.
Well,
should
it wasn't necessarily that the U.S. is leaving. It was the deal that Trump made, and it was the way he went about making it. It was like an America First deal, where it was all about, okay, we're going to leave, but just don't attack U.S. troops, but you can keep attacking the Afghan government forces. And that's the issue, is the way that the U.S. went about negotiating gave the Taliban all the leverage. And then Biden came into office and just kind of went along with what Trump did, because because he can. He's already a commitment that was made under Trump to leave by May 1st and whatever, and so he just carried on with Trump's sort of America First deal, and that just left the Afghan government in a situation where it's the weaker party, and the Taliban doesn't even need to worry about dealing with it. They can just go about their business. And the other issue in Afghanistan is if you're going to hand the country over to the Taliban, the problem is the Taliban has no experience governing. All it knows how to do is to be all it knows how to do is commit violence to get its way. Really, it doesn't have technocrats. It doesn't have people with any experience running a country, and so that's going to be a problem too. But it is what it is. This is the situation we're in, and there's a lot of people in Afghanistan who are basically just going to leave now, and you're going to have another wave of Afghan refugees, and they're going to be leaving because the country is going to be completely unstable for a while, and people are just going to be at war and fighting, and the Taliban's going to be eating up more territory.
Shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to ask you about last week's big debate between Jackson Hinkle and Vaught